The smell in the shed at Hatfield wasn't oil and petrol. It was glue. On a grey November morning in 1940, a test pilot named John Cat's Eyes Cunningham climbed into a strange twin-engined aircraft that looked less like a war machine and more like something a furniture maker had dreamt up after a nervous breakdown. The men who had built it wore carpenter's aprons, not oily overalls. Instead of piles of aluminium offcuts, the floor was littered with curls of spruce and balsa. Someone muttered the joke that had been going around the airfield for weeks. A wooden bomber, no guns and only 2 men. Jerry will shoot it down with a cigarette lighter. Cunningham smiled, pulled the canopy shut and pushed the throttles forward. What happened next would shock not only the RAF, but eventually the Luftwaffe itself. The wooden bomber leapt down the grass strip and clawed into the air with a smooth, effortless acceleration. When Cunningham raised the nose and pushed the throttles up, the new aircraft didn't just feel quick, it felt unnaturally quick. Above Hatfield, the Merlin engines howled, the airframe hummed, and the needle on the airspeed indicator slid past speeds that most fighter pilots could only dream of. Within months, the de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito would prove to be one of the fastest operational aircraft in the world, capable of more than 400 miles per hour while still carrying a bomber's payload. Built largely of wood at a time when the fashion was all metal-stressed skin, it would become famous under a nickname that sounded more like a joke than a threat: the Wooden Wonder. To the men of the Luftwaffe who would spend the next years trying and mostly failing to catch it, it became simply der Mosquito, the mosquito, a tiny, infuriating predator they could hear, sometimes glimpse, but almost never swat. To understand how such an unlikely machine ever reached the sky, we need to go back to the tense years just before the Second World War, and to a designer who was stubborn enough to ignore almost everyone around him. Geoffrey de Havilland was not a young radical when he proposed the Mosquito. He was one of Britain's elder statesmen of aviation, a man whose career stretched back to the fragile biplanes of the First World War. In the late 1930s, his company had built the sleek DH-91 Albatross airliner, whose smooth wooden fuselage and long, clean wings were a minor engineering miracle. De Havilland believed that the same techniques, plywood skins over a balsa core, carefully bonded with advanced glues into a stiff, light shell, could be used to build a bomber that relied not on guns but on speed. The idea sounded insane to many people in the Air Ministry. Standard thinking in the late 1930s was that bombers needed turrets, gunners and armour. They would inevitably be slower than fighters, so they were supposed to defend themselves with streams of bullets sprayed in every direction. British specifications called for multi-engined aircraft with powered turrets in the nose, tail, sometimes even on the back and belly, each turret adding weight, drag and complexity. De Havilland proposed the opposite. Strip away all the turrets, strip away most of the crew, build the aircraft as small and smooth as possible, and let 2 powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines do the rest. The bomber, he argued, would be so fast and would fly so high that enemy fighters would struggle to catch it. Its speed would be its armour. Its smooth wooden skin would give it a tiny radar echo compared to the big aluminium heavies that were then on the drawing board. He also made a very practical argument that appealed to a country already thinking about total war. Britain's industry could not afford to build every aircraft out of aluminium and high-grade steel. Those materials would be needed for Spitfires, Hurricanes, tanks and ships. Wood, by contrast, was cheap, familiar and, crucially, could be worked by an army of skilled cabinet makers and carpenters whose peacetime livelihoods were disappearing. The Mosquito could be built in dispersed workshops, in furniture factories and even piano works, far from the obvious targets of German bombers. At first, the Air Ministry was not impressed. Officials wanted more guns, more crew, more insurance. They suggested forward and rear-firing machine guns and even demanded a dorsal turret. They disliked the idea of sending only 2 men deep into enemy territory, with no defensive armament at all. De Havilland fought back with drawings, wind tunnel data and sheer experience. Add a turret, he pointed out, And you add drag. Add drag and the bomber slows down. Slow it down enough and it will fall into the very envelope where enemy fighters can easily intercept it. At that point, all you have really done is built another conventional bomber, only this one is made of expensive wood and has no particular advantage. Thankfully for history, the designer found an ally in Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, the Air Council member responsible for research and development. Freeman was willing to gamble on the idea of an unarmed fast bomber, and in 1940 a contract was issued for a prototype under specification B1-40, followed soon after by a fighter version under a separate specification. Then war overtook the drawing board. By the summer of 1940, Britain was fighting for its life in the Battle of Britain. Every available engineer was being asked to turn Hurricanes and Spitfires off the production line faster, and there were pressures to cancel anything that did not look absolutely essential. Twice, the Mosquito came close to being killed as a paper project, sacrificed to free Merlin engines for more conventional types. Twice, Freeman and a handful of believers managed to save it. Behind the scenes, de Havilland's teams kept working at a furious pace. Instead of the conventional structure of frames and stringers covered in metal, the Mosquito's fuselage was built in 2 half-shells over concrete moulds. Layers of birch and balsa were laid down like the plews of some gigantic surfboard, soaked in glue and pressed together under heat and pressure. When the shells cured, they were joined along the centre line, with bulkheads and fittings already bonded in place. The result was a smooth, oval fuselage that was strong, light, and remarkably easy to produce once the tooling existed. Wings and tail surfaces were wooden as well, with spruce spars and plywood skins, their fabric covering doped taut like the surface of a drum. Metal was saved for high-stress items, engine mounts, undercarriage, and of course the Merlins themselves. What looked like a crazy throwback to the biplane era was, in fact, a highly modern monocoque structure using materials that British industry understood intimately. All of this brings us back to that chilly November day and John Cunningham's first flight in the Mosquito prototype, serial W4050. The aircraft had twice the surface area of a Spitfire and weighed more than twice as much, but it also had something no single-engine fighter could match. 2 Merlin engines producing a combined power output that dwarfed anything else in the air. Early estimates suggested that, in spite of its size, it might just edge out a Spitfire Mecha 2 in speed. In trials at Boscombe Down in early 1941, W450 did more than that. It consistently outran the Spitfire used as a chase aircraft, demonstrating that the concept had worked. A bomber that was as fast as or faster than contemporary fighters. The pilots' reports from those early flights make fascinating reading. They praised the lightness of the controls and the responsive handling at speed. The Mosquito felt like a large fighter, not a ponderous bomber. It could roll and turn smoothly, and with both Merlins singing it had a climb rate that would embarrass many single-engine aircraft of the day. The only real complaints were about its behaviour at very low speed and on landing, where the large wing and high approach speeds demanded skill and respect. What really mattered, though, were the numbers. With its original Merlin engines, the prototype exceeded 370 miles per hour in level flight. Fitted later with more powerful 2-stage supercharged Merlins, W4050 would go on to exceed 430 millipasmus at altitude. Extraordinary performance for an aircraft carrying bombs or cameras. In the spring of 1941, the Air Ministry finally authorized mass production. The initial order covered photographic reconnaissance machines, fighters, and, crucially, a batch of unarmed bombers. By the end of January 1942, contracts had been placed for over 1,300 Mosquitoes of various marks, and arrangements were in progress to build hundreds more in Canada. Even then, few people outside de Havilland and a handful of RAF officers understood just how important this wooden aircraft was going to become. The first Mosquitoes to go to war did not carry bombs or guns at all. They carried cameras. High-altitude photo reconnaissance has always been one of the most dangerous but vital jobs in aerial warfare. Before you can bomb a target, you need to find it. Before you can evaluate whether your bombers have done any damage, you need photographs. In 1941, British reconnaissance pilots were still flying modified Spitfires, stripped of guns and armour for extra speed and range. They were good aircraft for the job, but they carried only one engine. Over enemy territory, a single engine is a single point of failure. If it quits, you become a very expensive glider. The Mosquito offered something new. 2 engines, high altitude, long range and room in the nose for large, high-quality cameras. PR, photo reconnaissance versions of the Mosquito began flying secret missions even before the bomber variant officially entered service. Their crews quickly discovered something remarkable. German radar operators could see them, sometimes, but by the time fighters were scrambled and climbed to height, the wooden intruders were already leaving. The combination of speed, altitude, and a relatively small radar cross-section made them extremely hard to intercept. Soon, the RAF wanted to know whether the same qualities could be used offensively. In 1942, No. 115 Squadron RAF became the first unit to operate Mosquito bombers in combat. Their aircraft were the Beamer Fiat, an unarmed bomber variant that could carry 4 500-pound bombs inside a slim bomb bay. In an era when many RAF bombers still staggered towards targets at barely 250 mm and relied on darkness to hide them, the idea of sending a 2-man, unarmed 350-plus EMP bomber on daylight raids seemed at best daring and at worst suicidal. So they tried it. Early Mosquito raids were small, surgical operations aimed at targets that were symbolically or operationally important, but too difficult or too risky to tackle with a large force. One of the most famous was the Oslo raid of 25 September 1942. 4 Mosquitoes took off from Scotland and skimmed low across the North Sea to attack the Gestapo headquarters in the Victoria Terrace building in Oslo. It was a long, exhausting mission of almost 5 hours, much of it at altitude so low that pilots were dodging waves and coastal cliffs. When German fighters finally intercepted them near the target, the Mosquitoes simply used their speed to break contact. Only one of the 4 aircraft was lost. The others returned, having shown that a handful of wooden bombers could strike deep inside occupied territory in daylight and escape. These pinpoint raids were not just about physical damage, they were psychological weapons. In January 1943, Mosquitoes from 105 and 139 squadrons attacked Berlin in broad daylight, precisely as Hermann Göring was scheduled to address a rally celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. The bombs did little real military harm, but the symbolism was devastating. British wooden bombers had reached the heart of the Reich's capital, almost at will, humiliating the Luftwaffe commander in front of his own people. Göring later raged that he could accept British production of 4-engine bombers, but not the fact that they had built a damn plane made of wood that outpaces our best fighters. Statements attributed to him are often embellished, but contemporary German documents make clear that the Mosquito's speed and elusiveness were a serious and continuing embarrassment. From the German point of view, this was more than a public relations problem. The Mosquito did not come alone. It came in many forms. Even as the bomber squadrons refined their low-level tactics, other units were receiving Mosquito night fighters equipped with airborne interception radar. From mid-1942 onwards, Mosquito fighters began stalking German bombers over the North Sea and the English countryside, disrupting raids and slowly taking over from the older, heavier bow fighters. Their speed meant they could climb quickly to meet incoming formations. Their twin engines made them safer over the dark sea or blacked-out cities, where an engine failure in a single-engine fighter often meant death. The Mosquito's wooden airframe, which had seemed such a gamble, quietly paid off in ways nobody had anticipated. Because most of the structure did not corrode like metal, aircraft could withstand harsh weather and heavy use without the same fatigue issues as their aluminium cousins. Because the materials and skills were widely available, production could be scaled up even while Britain's metalworking industries concentrated on other aircraft. By the time manufacture ended in 1950, a total of 7,781 Mosquitoes of all types had been built in Britain, Canada and Australia. For the crews who flew it, what mattered was not just the statistics, but how the aircraft felt. Bomb aimer navigators sitting in the glazed nose of the bomber version remembered the eerie sensation of seeing roads, rivers and German towns flash beneath them at hundreds of miles per hour, with no friendly formation in sight. Unlike in a Lancaster or Halifax, there were no turrets, no gunners, no long lines of other bombers to left and right. The Mosquito crew lived inside a small world of maps, instruments and engine noise, trusting in the aircraft's speed, their own navigation, and a very slim margin for error. They also knew, though, that their chances of surviving the war were much better than those of their comrades in the heavy bomber force. While the average casualty rate for RAF Bomber Command was appallingly high, Mosquito bomber units ended the war with the lowest loss rates of any of the command's types. When things went wrong, when flak found its mark or a night fighter got lucky, the Mosquito could not soak up punishment like a four-engine giant, but it was so rarely caught at all that statistically its crews simply faced fewer lethal situations. From the German side, this was maddening. Radar stations would pick up a blip, often smaller than that of a big bomber. Controllers would scramble fighters and direct them towards the contact. By the time the interceptors reached altitude, the blip was vanishing. On the ground, searchlight batteries and flak crews reported fast, low-flying twin-engined aircraft coming and going almost before they could traverse their guns. The Luftwaffe tried to respond systematically. In 1943, they created special high-altitude fighter units, Jagdgeschwader 25 and its sister unit Jagdgeschwader 50, specifically to hunt the Mosquito. Equipped with tuned Bf-109s and flown by experienced pilots, these formations were supposed to be the answer to the Mosquito problem. In practice, they claimed only a handful of victories for disproportionate losses of their own aircraft, and were eventually diverted to more conventional duties intercepting American heavy bombers. The Germans also tried to copy the concept outright. The Focke-Wulf Tar 154, Mosquito, a fast twin-engined night fighter with a wooden structure, was intended as their answer to the British Wooden Wonder. It never came close. Production was crippled by shortages of suitable glue. Disastrous adhesive substitutes literally caused airframes to fall apart, and only a few dozen were completed before the project collapsed. All of this was happening while the Mosquito's own story was still accelerating. What began as an unarmed bomber and a photo-reconnaissance platform was rapidly turning into something more, a true multi-role aircraft in an era before that term existed. As the war entered its later more complex phases, Mosquitoes would be found in the most unlikely places, marking targets for thousand-bomber raids, prowling as night fighters over German airfields, skimming wave tops to attack shipping, and conducting some of the most daring precision strikes of the entire conflict. That, however, is a story in itself. That story began in earnest in 1943, when the Mosquito stopped being an interesting experiment and became one of the central tools of the RAF's air war over Europe. By then, crews on both sides already knew its outline. German bomber pilots had met the night fighter version over the dark fields of England and the North Sea. British airmen had seen the bomber variant streak past them on training flights, climbing like a big impatient fighter. What they were only beginning to understand was how many different shapes this single wooden airframe could take. For the men of Bomber Command, the most important change came with a new idea. Instead of sending hundreds of heavy bombers groping for a city in the dark, why not send a handful of fast aircraft ahead of the main force to find and mark the exact target? If those aircraft could place coloured flares within a few dozen yards of the aiming point, the heavies could follow those markers like a trail of fire. The Mosquito was perfect for that job. It could cruise higher and faster than the Lancaster stream, which meant it could get to the target first, spend precious minutes establishing accurate markers, and still be gone before the densest flak barrage built up. The RAF's Pathfinder force began to integrate mosquitoes into its operations, first experimentally and then in ever greater numbers. Squadrons equipped with specialized navigation aids like the oboe blind bombing system used the aircraft to draw invisible circles in the sky, dropping markers with a degree of accuracy that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. Oboe worked on a simple but revolutionary principle. Ground stations in Britain tracked the mosquito's position by radar and sent precise timing signals to the aircraft. When the timing was exactly right, the navigator released his flares or bombs, often without ever seeing the target through cloud or smoke. On 5 March 1943, a small force of oboe-equipped mosquitoes marked the Krupp works at Essen so accurately that Bomber Command's main force following those markers inflicted serious damage on a vital industrial complex in one night. Senior officers later saw that raid as the moment when the strategic bombing campaign shifted from bludgeoning to something closer to surgery. Because mosquitoes flew relatively few aircraft per mission, their losses were numerically small. Over time, the statistics told a remarkable story. Pathfinder mosquitoes flew more than 28,000 sorties for Bomber Command and lost just over 100 aircraft a loss rate far lower than that of the heavy bombers they were guiding. In a grim arithmetic where survival was usually a matter of luck, flying a wooden mosquito turned out to be one of the least dangerous jobs in the bomber offensive, precisely because enemy fighters and gunners so rarely managed to catch one. If the Pathfinders showed what the mosquito could do at altitude and distance, another set of missions proved what it could do when flown as low as the pilots dared. From late 1943 onwards, Allied planners occasionally faced problems that normal bombing tactics simply couldn't solve. Some targets were buried in crowded cities where a mass raid would kill thousands of civilians. Others were so politically sensitive that only the smallest possible force could be risked. A handful involved prisoners members of the resistance held in jails that had become death traps as execution dates approached. For these jobs, they turned again and again to the mosquito. Perhaps the most famous of these operations took place on 18th of February 1944, when 18 Mosquito fighter bombers of 140 wing thundered across the English Channel at barely mast height, heading for the prison at Amiens in northern France. The mission, later known as Operation Jericho, was to blow open the prison walls and cell blocks to allow resistance prisoners to escape before mass executions could be carried out. In wintry weather, with snow squalls obscuring much of the route, the mosquitoes flew in tight formation so low that their wingtips sometimes seemed level with the hedgerows. Each aircraft carried 2 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses. The first wave smashed holes in the outer walls. The second struck the main buildings to disrupt guards and create chaos. One mosquito, fitted with a forward-facing camera, recorded the attack, and the film shows the aircraft roaring in at rooftop height, the prison filling the windscreen in the final seconds before bomb release. The results were messy and tragic, but, in the brutal logic of war, still counted as a success. Over 250 prisoners escaped, including dozens of resistance members and political detainees, though many were killed or later recaptured. 2 mosquitoes and their crews were lost, including Group Captain Charles Pickard, the wing commander who had led the attack. To his men, Pickard's death was a bitter reminder that speed and skill could never eliminate risk entirely. But the raid proved beyond doubt that a small force of fast wooden aircraft could punch a precise hole in the enemy's control system in broad daylight and get most of its crews home. Amiens was not unique. Mosquitoes carried out similar low-level strikes against Gestapo headquarters and other high-value targets in cities across occupied Europe. In October 1944, for example, they attacked the Gestapo building in Aarhus, Denmark, destroying records and killing key officials. In March 1945, another mosquito force hit the Shellhus, the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, again skimming in at treetop height along city streets to place their bombs with surgical precision. In both cases, the attacks degraded German intelligence operations and heartened local resistance movements, at the cost of relatively small numbers of aircraft and crews. For the Luftwaffe officers responsible for air defence, these missions were a nightmare. The raids were too fast, too low, too small to counter with the tactics they had developed against large bomber formations. Radar could sometimes pick up the Mosquitoes as vague traces clinging to the ground clutter, but by the time fighters climbed and tried to intercept, the British aircraft were already streaking back towards the sea. German frustration was not limited to the daytime. At night, Mosquito squadrons were wreaking quiet havoc on the Luftwaffe's own bomber and night fighter forces. Defensively, Mosquito night fighters patrolled the approaches to British cities, guided by ground radar and, later, their own onboard sets. As German bombers crossed the coast, a Mosquito crew would be steered into position, their radar operator peering at a green glowing screen until a smear of light resolved into a target. Closing in from behind and below, they would wait until the bomber loomed as a dark shape against the stars, and then fire a burst of cannon shells into its wing roots or fuel tanks. Successful crews might claim multiple kills in a single night, and the mere possibility of an unseen Mosquito lurking nearby added strain to already exhausted German airmen. Offensively, other Mosquito units flew as intruders over German territory, stalking the very fighters that were supposed to defend the Reich. They orbited near night fighter bases, waiting for the telltale pattern of lights as a returning aircraft approached to land, or they followed streams of German bombers heading out to attack targets in Britain, picking off stragglers. By tying down enemy night fighters over their own airfields and scattering them with sudden attacks, the intruder Mosquitoes made it even harder for the Luftwaffe to mount coordinated defences against Bomber Command's main forces. The Mosquito's offensive reach extended seaward as well. Along the coast of Norway, where narrow fjords and twisting inlets provided sheltered routes for German merchant ships and small warships, RAF Coastal Command formed a specialised formation known as the Banff Strike Wing. Operating from bases in Scotland, Mosquito squadrons flew hazardous low-level missions against convoys hugging the cliffs and mountain walls. They attacked with combinations of rockets, cannon fire and bombs, often in the face of ferocious flak from ships and shore batteries. E.D. Forum's pilots who flew with the Banff Wing later described some of their sorties as the most terrifying they had ever experienced. The Mosquitoes would approach at wave-top height over the North Sea, climb briefly to cross the coastal hills, then drop back down into fjords that seemed barely wider than the aircraft's wingspan. German ships lurked beneath overhanging rock ledges, their decks bristling with guns. A strike leader would pick a primary target, perhaps a tanker carrying fuel vital for the U-boat fleet, and the entire formation would sweep in, unleashing salvos of rockets and cannon fire at almost point-blank range before clawing back up over the towering valley sides. Coastal Command also experimented with giving the Mosquito an even more fearsome bite. One specialised version, the FB was fitted with a modified 57mm 6-pounder anti-tank gun in its nose, complete with an automatic loader adapted from a British company that normally produced cigarette-making machines. The gun, known as the Moline 6-pounder, turned the aircraft into a kind of flying tank destroyer, capable of punching heavy shells through the hulls of submarines and smaller surface vessels. Crews nicknamed this variant the Tsetse, after a biting African fly, and used it to ambush U-boats and shipping in the Bay of Biscay and other hunting grounds. Against the V-1 flying bomb, the Mosquito found yet another role. When Germany began launching these pilotless weapons against London and other cities in 1944, RAF night fighters and anti-aircraft units were thrown into an urgent improvised defence. The V-1s were small, fast, and flew at low altitude, but the Mosquito's speed and climb allowed it to intercept many of them. Some pilots simply shot the missiles down with gunfire. Others used a more delicate method, pulling alongside and gently slipping a wing under one of the V-1's stubby wings before rolling away, disturbing the airflow and causing the bomb to tumble and crash short of its target. Contemporary accounts and film show Mosquitoes performing both techniques. What made all of this so shocking to the Luftwaffe was not just the aircraft's performance, but the fact that it refused to fit neatly into any category. German planners could have coped with a fast light bomber or an effective night fighter or a capable naval strike aircraft. The problem was that Mosquitoes were doing all of those jobs at once. Every time they studied their intelligence summaries, the same name appeared: de Havilland Mosquito. It was there in reports from Norway, from France, from Germany itself. It appeared in the logbooks of bomber crews shot down on their way to England, and in the angry debriefs of radar officers whose screens had shown a fleeting blip and then nothing. When Luftwaffe staff officers drafted plans to counter the Mosquito menace, they discovered that they were chasing a moving target literally and figuratively. They had tried building their own wooden twin-engined fighter, the TR-154, but glue problems and production difficulties turned it into an expensive failure. They had tried tuning high-altitude interceptors and dedicating entire wings to hunting the British aircraft, only to see those units quietly retasked when the American heavy bomber threat grew. They improved their radar and flak, and filled likely Mosquito routes with night fighters, yet the British raids continued. Hermann Göring's oft-quoted complaint about a British wooden aircraft flying faster than his fighters is probably embroidered in its most colourful versions, but it reflects a genuine humiliation. German documents from the period show that the Mosquito's ability to reach Berlin and other key cities almost at will, sometimes with cameras, sometimes with marker flares, sometimes with bombs, was a constant irritation to the Nazi leadership. Meanwhile, back in Britain, carpenters and cabinet makers, who had never expected to contribute directly to a war effort, continued to assemble fuselage shells in dispersed factories. In cities where furniture and piano workshops had once crafted polished dining tables and concert instruments, workers now bent over jigs and moulds, laminating layers of birch and balsa. Many of them never saw the finished aircraft. They were producing components, not complete machines, and those components would be shipped by road to final assembly plants at Hatfield, Leavesden and other airfields. If any of them wondered what was happening to the strange wooden shells they handled every day, they would have found the answer in the war news, though never in full. Reports spoke of light bombers carrying out daring raids, of fast fighters ambushing enemy aircraft at night, of coastal aircraft attacking shipping. Only those who followed aviation closely, or who had relatives in the RAF, would have realized that in many of those stories, hidden beneath the generic category, was the same distinctive silhouette. As the war in Europe moved into its final phase, the Mosquito's role continued to grow. In the spring of 1945, with German resistance collapsing but still dangerous, Mosquito squadrons ranged deep into enemy territory, hitting rail yards, bridges, and troop concentrations with a ferocity born of long experience. Pathfinders marked targets for some of the last large-scale raids on Berlin and other cities, while intruder units prowled the shrinking pockets of Luftwaffe activity, ensuring that German pilots had little chance to rest or regroup. By April and May, some Mosquito crews were flying armed reconnaissance missions, almost like police patrols, looking for signs of organized resistance and, increasingly, for opportunities to drop relief supplies or direct ground forces to pockets of surrendered troops. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as a risky experiment had become one of the RAF's most trusted tools, valued as much for its flexibility as for its raw speed. Yet even at that moment of triumph, the Mosquito's future was uncertain. Jet propulsion was no longer a theoretical curiosity. British engineers were already test-flying early jets, and everyone understood that their performance would soon leave piston-engined aircraft behind. The wooden bomber that flew like a fighter had arrived just in time to play a crucial role in the last great piston-engine war, and just late enough that it would soon have to share the sky with machines that made even its speed look modest. When the guns finally fell silent over Europe in May 1945, the Mosquito should, by all normal rules of aviation history, have been on borrowed time. It had been born in an emergency, tuned in combat, and pushed to the edge of what piston engines and propellers could do. Yet even as jet prototypes howled up from British runways, squadrons of wooden twin-engined aircraft were still taking off in the dawn half-light, loaded not with bombs now, but with cameras, fuel, and the last urgent tasks of a world trying to rebuild. The end of the war in Europe did not mean the end of flying for Mosquito crews. In the Far East, where the war against Japan continued into the summer of 1945, long-range photo-reconnaissance variants were still being delivered. One of the last wartime versions, the PR-MK-34, carried its fuel not only in the wings but in a huge tank in the bomb bay, trading armour and guns for range. Loaded to the limits of its wooden structure, it could roam thousands of miles over jungle and ocean at speeds that kept it beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters. In one mission over Burma, a Mosquito of Eastern Air Command covered roughly 2,400 miles in under 9 hours, setting a distance record for a twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft. For pilots who had spent years flying low over occupied Europe, these missions felt strangely lonely. There were no searchlights, no Messerschmitts, no flak bursts clawing at the sky, just endless green jungle, or the flat grey of the Indian Ocean scrolling beneath the nose. The danger now came from weather, fatigue, and the simple fact that if a Merlin coughed and died over those distances, the nearest friendly airfield might be hundreds of miles away. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, some Mosquitoes, like many other Allied aircraft, found themselves suddenly and awkwardly without an obvious enemy. But air forces are conservative institutions. They do not discard a reliable tool lightly, especially one as versatile as the Wooden Wonder. In the first post-war years, the RAF was still largely a piston-engine force. Meteor jets were entering service, and de Havilland's own Vampire was on the way, but they existed in small numbers and suffered from the usual teething problems of new technology. The Mosquito, by contrast, was a known quantity. It had proven itself as bomber, fighter-bomber, night fighter, pathfinder and maritime strike aircraft, and crews trusted it. As a result, many squadrons kept their Mossies and simply changed missions. In Germany and occupied Europe, Mosquito bomber and fighter bomber units shifted to tasks like armed reconnaissance, patrol and training. In the Far East, reconnaissance Mosquitoes photographed vast areas of Burma, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, mapping former battlefields and new borders for planners who were trying to turn wartime chaos into peacetime order. Not everything about the aircraft suited its new environment. In hot, humid climates, the very materials that had made the Mosquito possible during the war began to show their limits. Glues that had performed well in the cool, damp air of northern Europe sometimes deteriorated under tropical heat. In Burma, one RAF squadron found its trial batch of Mosquitoes plagued by structural issues and returned to more conventional Beaufighters instead. Engineers responded, improving adhesives and adjusting construction techniques. The type remained in high demand for roles where speed and range mattered more than ultimate structural life. Commonwealth air forces, including those of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, continued to operate Mosquitoes into the late 1940s and early 1950s, finding them ideal for patrolling long coastlines and conducting photographic surveys of vast, lightly mapped territories. At the same time, de Havilland's design office was already looking beyond the Mosquito, even as it refined the existing airframe. The company took the lessons learned from building thousands of wooden high-performance aircraft and poured them into two very different successors. The first was the de Havilland Hornet, a sleek, long-range, twin-engined fighter intended for operations in the Far East. Structurally, it was a close cousin of the Mosquito, a slender wooden fuselage, composite wood and metal wings, powerful Merlins on the leading edges. But everything about it was slimmer, sharper, optimized for speed and climb. In 1944, when the Hornet first flew, it was one of the fastest piston-engined aircraft in the world, capable of more than 470 miles per hour, proof that the wooden construction techniques pioneered on the Mosquito still had performance headroom. The second successor was far more radical, the de Havilland Vampire, one of Britain's first operational jet fighters. Here the influence of the Mosquito was less obvious in appearance. The Vampire had a short central fuselage pod and 2 tail booms, but very clear in engineering philosophy. De Havilland used many of the same ideas about stressed skin construction, pilot visibility, and tricycle undercarriage layout that had been validated in Mosquito service. The wooden cockpit pod of the early Vampires owed much to the company's confidence in high-speed wooden structures. In a sense, then, the Mosquito was both a pinnacle and a bridge, the last great flowering of piston engine, propeller-driven design, and a direct ancestor of the early jet age. Back in RAF service, the aircraft quietly adapted to a world that was changing under its wings. Heavy bomber units began to re-equip with newer types, and by the early 1950s the Mosquito had largely disappeared from frontline bombing roles in Europe. The final dedicated bomber version, the B-35, entered service after the war and soldiered on as a night bomber until around 1954, when jet bombers and newer designs finally displaced it. Many B-35s were then converted into target tugs, towing bright fabric sleeves for jet fighters to shoot at during gunnery practice. Those humble duties would keep a handful of wooden airframes flying long after their combat days were over. Elsewhere, the Mosquito still found itself flying into danger. In Southeast Asia, the collapse of European empires and the rise of independence movements created a series of local wars in which the RAF again found use for a fast, well-understood aircraft. During the Malayan Emergency, a long counter-insurgency campaign fought between Commonwealth forces and communist guerrillas from 1948 to 1960, photo-reconnaissance Mosquitoes of No. 81 Squadron were tasked with finding hidden camps, supply dumps and jungle tracks from the air. One of these aircraft, a PR-34A, flew what is widely regarded as the last operational combat mission by an RAF Mosquito on 15th of December 1955, photographing a suspected terrorist base deep in the Malayan forest. It was a fitting final mission, unarmed, fast and precise, using speed and altitude instead of guns, exactly the philosophy Geoffrey de Havilland had argued for 15 years earlier when he first proposed his unarmed wooden bomber. Even after their combat service ended, Mosquitoes continued to appear in RAF order books and flight schedules. Target tug units operated TT-35 variants well into the early 1960s, their yellow and black stripes bright against the grey British sky, as they towed targets for jet fighters like the Hunter and the Meteor. An aircraft that had once outrun the best piston-engined fighters of the Luftwaffe now found itself sharing circuits and mess halls with supersonic prototypes. The last RAF Mosquitoes, all target tugs, were finally retired in May 1963 after more than 2 decades of service. By then, the Mosquito had already made the jump from operational history to legend. In 1964, when filmmakers needed authentic aircraft to star in the war movie 633 Squadron, they turned to those very last TT-35s. The target tugs were hastily repainted with gun ports and wartime nose markings, standing in for fighter bombers from an earlier phase of the conflict. Their appearance on screen fixed the silhouette of the Mosquito in popular culture. A long glazed nose, slim wooden fuselage and broad, slightly swept wings slicing through the clouds over Scottish valleys, masquerading as Norwegian fjords. If you visit an aviation museum today and stand beneath one of the surviving examples, it can be hard to grasp just how radical this aircraft was when it first flew. For modern eyes used to composites and stealth coatings, the idea of an advanced warplane made of wood no longer seems absurd. But in 1940, when fighters and bombers alike were increasingly all metal, the Mosquito's birch and balsa construction looked like a step backwards. It turned out to be a step sideways, into a space where British industry had materials and skills that were not under immediate pressure from other demands. It also gave the Mosquito, unintentionally, a form of proto-stealth. Wood reflects radar differently from metal. Combined with its relatively small size and smooth surfaces, the Mosquito often produced a weaker radar return than bulkier aluminium bombers, making it harder for early German radar stations to detect and track. Wartime operators did not use the word stealth, but when they described mosquitoes as hard to pick up on radar, they were observing the same principle. The numbers themselves tell part of the story. Depending on how you count prototypes and post-war airframes, around 7,180 Mosquitoes were built in 42 different major variants, on 3 continents, serving in more than a dozen air forces. Some were pure bombers, some pure fighters. Others carried cameras, rockets, torpedoes, or enormous guns. A few were trainers. A few more were experimental testbeds for radar, weapons, or new engines. The basic design, however, remained recognizable from first prototype to last target tug. 2 Merlins, a crew of 2 sitting side by side, a slim fuselage built like an exquisitely engineered piece of furniture, and a philosophy that prioritized speed, agility, and precision over brute force. From the Luftwaffe's point of view, this philosophy was deeply unwelcome. German night fighter logs from the later years of the war are full of references to Mosquito terror. The fear among pilots that, as they came into land exhausted and low on fuel, an unseen Mosquito might be lurking behind them, waiting to strike. Bomber crews bound for Britain learned to dread the cold bluish flicker of a radar screen resolving an unknown contact into a Mosquito closing in from astern. Air defense planners struggled to allocate scarce aircraft and fuel to counter raids that might be photographic, might be diversions, might be pathfinders for heavies, or might simply be small independent attacks that left fires burning in Berlin or Hamburg with no big formation to explain them. When Hermann Göring complained that the British had the impertinence to build a plane like the Mosquito, which they have now built in large numbers and which flies faster than our fighters, he was not just venting personal frustration. He was acknowledging, however grudgingly, that his Air Force had been outthought as well as outproduced. From the British side, the Mosquito story carries a different lesson. It shows what can happen when a designer is allowed to challenge orthodoxy at exactly the right moment. Geoffrey de Havilland did not ignore the needs of war. He simply argued that there was more than one way to meet them. Where conventional thinking demanded more guns and armour to keep bombers alive, he proposed speed and altitude. Where planners saw shortages of aluminium as a crippling constraint, he saw the possibility of using wood and civilian skills to bypass the bottleneck. Where the Air Ministry initially saw an unarmed bomber as a liability, he saw a machine that could choose when and where to fight or whether to be seen at all. In that sense, the Mosquito's success was not a lucky accident. It was the result of a chain of decisions that began long before the first flight, to trust an unconventional design, to protect it from cancellation during the most desperate phase of the Battle of Britain, to keep refining it through new variants, and to give it to crews who were willing to explore just how far its performance could be pushed. It is also a reminder that technology does not exist in a vacuum. The Mosquito worked as well as it did because it fitted the particular circumstances of Britain's war. A nation with a strong woodworking industry, facing sustained air attack and severe resource constraints, needed an aircraft that could be built in dispersed factories from non-strategic materials and that could hit back at the enemy quickly and flexibly. In another country, with different industries and different strategic needs, the same design might never have emerged or might have been discarded as a curiosity. Finally, the Mosquito's career hints at something that historians of air power sometimes forget. Speed is not just a number on a specification sheet. It is a kind of psychological weapon. For Allied crews, the knowledge that their wooden bomber could outrun most enemy fighters brought a confidence that statistics alone cannot convey. For German defenders, the knowledge that somewhere above them, beyond the reach of their guns and often even their eyes, small groups of Mosquitoes could appear at will and vanish just as quickly, created a constant wearing sense of vulnerability. The aircraft's very existence told both sides that the old rules, slow, heavily defended bombers lumbering through walls of flak no longer fully applied. When you put all of this together, the nickname Wooden Wonder stops sounding like a piece of affectionate propaganda and starts to feel like a straightforward description. It was wooden. It was a wonder. A bomber that flew like a fighter, that could be a night hunter one sortie and a precision strike aircraft the next, that shocked the Luftwaffe not with its size but with its speed and versatility, and that left behind, in the shape of aircraft like the Hornet, Vampire, and the first jet generations, a legacy far larger than its thin wooden skins.